All right, so this week I was going to talk about EA and virtue ethics, but I thought it'd be a lot more interesting to talk about thought experiments. So here are 8 thought experiments that you should know that have to do with ethical or moral dilemmas. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on these and where you fall. So what is EA? EA is an idea, maximize the good you can do through your career, projects, and donations. It's also a community or a movement of a lot of individuals and organizations who care about this idea, who are committed to trying to do the most good, if you will, and who are gathering around. So the first thought experiment I want to talk about is what's called the experience machine. And this is something coined from the philosopher Robert Nozick. By the way, for each of these experiments, I'm not a philosopher, so I probably won't describe them in detail. I'll just kind of give the basic essential details so that we can talk about them. But the experience machine goes like this. Imagine your brain or your body is hooked up to some kind of computer system that could trick you into experiencing an alternate reality. And imagine if this experience machine was so good it could replicate all of the good things you experience in your life right now, but make them even better, and essentially give you your heart's desire and just maximize the satisfaction of your desires or your preferences. And then the question becomes, well, if you have the choice, should you agree to hook yourself up to this machine, even though that would be taking you out of the real world, presumably? And this was meant to be some kind of criticism, I think, of a more utilitarian ethic, because there's something lacking, some would say, with a world linked up like a brain in a vat. But very well-known thought experiment. And here's kind of how the argument goes for this. I won't go through this, but you can read more about the arguments for each of these and what the authors were trying to say with them, if anything in particular. Another one from Robert Nozick is this utility monster thought experiment. And this goes, and correct me if I'm wrong, something like this. Imagine if there was a being that was capable of experiencing pleasure to a much greater degree than human beings can experience pleasure. But imagine that it had twisted pleasures. Imagine some kind of monster that could experience pleasure at a rate that was many hundreds of times greater, or 100 times greater, let's say, than the pleasure that a human being could experience. But this utility monster's favorite thing to do was to consume humans. Then the question would be, should you give yourself up to this monster to be eaten? And I think this is a criticism of from Robert Nozick of the more utilitarian, pleasure maximizing ethic. The third one that I think we've all heard of is this thought experiment of an axe murderer, where, of course, we all know we're not supposed to lie. It's bad to lie. But what if somebody were to knock on your door with an axe and say, I'm looking for so-and-so, who happens to be in your house right now, by the way. Do you go ahead and tell them that that person is in your house? Or do you tell a white lie? Do you mislead them? What if you're forced to tell a lie? Would that be such a bad thing in this situation? And this is, of course, some kind of, this is something that people talk about, especially with regards to the rule of lying. Is it ever okay to lie? So another thought experiment that comes to mind is maybe not so much a thought experiment per se, but sort of an illustration or a fun, I guess it is a thought experiment. Imagine that you were Superman, or you were a superhero, and you had superhuman powers for a day. What is it that you would do with these powers? What are in fact, what would be the best thing that you could do if you had Superman's powers for a day? Would it be to save 10 people from buildings, or would it be to power some kind of energy factory in a place in the world where energy is in scarce supply, and if you don't power it, then people will lose power in their homes, hundreds of thousands of people? Or like, what would this be? What would be like the most extravagant way? And this is something that a psychologist, Jeffrey Miller, wrote about, and this is a leeway into some discussions that he has about effective altruism Because effective altruism is about asking this question, sort of presuming, well, we have a lot of resources at our disposal. We might not be Superman or Spider-Man, but we do have these almost superhuman-like powers to be able to help people with modern technology and resources. What would be the best ways to do that? So kind of an interesting thought experiment for that. There is this classic example of the Ring of Gyges. I think I'm pronouncing that right, maybe not. And Plato writes about this in the Republic. And this is like the Ring of Power in the Lord of the Rings series, a kind of ring that if you put it on, it makes you invisible, really. So the question is, what would you do if you could put on this ring, and how would you live differently? And what does that say about who we really are, and how we ought to live? And I just find that very interesting. I think we've all heard this one. I don't know who thought of this thought experiment, but the Picasso in a burning building scenario goes something like this. Imagine there's a burning building, and there is somewhere in the building a famous Picasso painting valued at upwards of $30 million or more. Also in this building, there is a child, and unfortunately, there's not enough rescuers at the scene. But you could run into the building and save one before the building would collapse. Like many of these thought experiments, this is very dark. But the question goes, should you save the child, which is sort of the more immediate, obvious choice, or should you save the Picasso and then sell that, and then use the proceeds from the Picasso sale to save many, many more than one person? You could save, just from a rough back of the envelope calculation, hundreds, potentially thousands of lives through other more indirect means with that kind of money. So I'm curious what you all think. So we have two more thought experiments. The second to last is the ticking time bomb experiment. And this was first described, or at least strongly alluded to, by Jeremy Bentham, describing someone who has information that would lead to the death of many, many people and the suffering of many, many people. And you need to extract that information from somebody. What means would be appropriate to extract that information? I already sound like an interrogator, the words I'm using, but oftentimes, this is an applicable experiment for interrogation situations where there's maybe a terrorist who has a bomb planted somewhere, and an interrogator needs to learn where this bomb is, because it will harm many, many people. There's been a lot of different media series, television series about this concept. I think in Jack Bauer's 24, there's a lot of situations like this, I'm told. There's recently one with some kind of dirty bomb in Los Angeles, and the interrogators had to figure out from a suspect information about where the bomb is. And they were wrestling the whole time. Should we torture this person? We don't know for sure if they're guilty, but we think maybe there's a 50-50 chance or so that they are a terrorist and they know where this bomb is. Should we torture one innocent person or their family if it would lead to saving hundreds of thousands of lives from a ticking time bomb? Really, really hard thought experiment. And then finally, I think there are a lot of maybe thought experiments in Scripture we see. I know it's not really coined like a thought experiment, but when we see parables in Scripture, they're oftentimes presented like thought experiments, like Jesus is giving the listeners this story, and he wants the listeners to wrestle with them. I mean, sometimes there are obvious right answers, but oftentimes there's maybe obviously not a right answer, depending on which perspective you're looking at the story from. And of course, one of the most famous ethical stories in the New Testament is the story of the Good Samaritan, and this question of who is my neighbor and what you would have done. I mean, maybe it's like not obvious that like the priests and the Levites walking past this man in the desert was the wrong choice. I mean, maybe they had an extremely important mission. We don't know, but there's all sorts of like hypotheticals and interesting perspectives you could add to this story. But I think, in Scripture, I'd love to hear what you think, actually. What are some examples of thought experiments from Scripture that lead you to to think over your own ethics and morality. So some discussion questions. Yeah, do you have a favorite of these? Are there any of these that you feel strongly about, and why? What are your responses to these thought experiments teach you about yourself and your moral beliefs? And then is there any other experiment or parable or dilemma that you would wish to share? And of course, I'd love to hear how we can, through discussions about all of these experiments, not just talk about doing good or think about doing good, but really, really dedicate ourselves to doing more good. I very much invite us to share, ideas of how we can best do that. So great. Thanks for being part of this.